Hello and welcome to our exploration of the character of Sheila Birling, the female representative of the younger generation in J.B. Priestley's haunting 1945 thriller, An Inspector Calls. Now Sheila is a very interesting character and we see a transformation in her nature. She goes from being this very infantile capitalist to a very impassioned socialist. By the end of the play, she's very much advocating the idea of community over the self. It's fair to say that our Sheila is a bit of a brat. A brat? Well, she's prone to tantrums. She seems to be enchanted by shiny objects like Gerald's engagement ring, but she matures over the course of the play owing to the inspector's influence. At the start of the play, in Act 1, she helps contribute to that aura of unease that underpins or perhaps undermines the celebratory dinner. How does she contribute to this atmosphere? Well, she has this half playful, half serious manner about her. That's what the stage directions say when she's addressing Gerald. And it just creates this jarring note, this element of tension. Do you remember she says, except for last summer when you didn't come near me. So she's obviously anxious about why he stayed away. Obviously, this tension is created early doors because it is foreshadowing the inspector's arrival when he does an admirable demolition job on the family's unity. In Act 1, the stage directions say that Sheila is very pleased with life. Smug, basically. She's very conceited. In fact, she seems to be blissfully unaware that her pampered existence is sponsored by capitalist exploitation. You know, if Mr. Birling wasn't sweating them down the factory, she wouldn't be living in this little bubble of wealth, would she? I called Sheila earlier infantile because there's something very childish and childlike about Sheila, certainly at the start of the play. She doesn't call her parents mum and dad, as any self-respecting 20-something would. She calls them mummy and daddy. And I think one of the explanations for this is that because she's been cocooned in wealth and comfort her whole life, she's never really had to grow up. Mr. Birling at one point says to her, run along. And so you can see the parents with this very patronising attitude towards their offspring. So money's kind of protected her from the harsh realities of life in a way that, of course, it hasn't for Eva. And perhaps that childishness foreshadows her petulant sacking of Eva, born of jealousy, as we hear about later in the play. This picture reiterates my point. Eva's childish nature compels her to lash out, to behave in an immature fashion, such as getting a woman fired from her job purely because she smirked and because the old green eye was at work and Sheila was witheringly jealous of Eva's beauty. Clearly, Eva displays capitalist values at the start of the play, and a line that manifests this attitude is when Gerald whips out the bling and shows her the engagement ring, and Sheila says, now I really feel engaged. And it's almost as if she needs this shallow validation of a rock on her finger to make the relationship meaningful. It's not enough to feel loved. She needs to be able to parade that love in front of the world via this big whacking rock on her finger. This is Priestley denigrating or criticising what he sees as the superficial values of the Edwardian era, the way they prize surface over substance, form and style over depth and content. He sees it as a very shallow era where morals are kind of subjugated, undermined by this endeavour to show a polished, mannered facade. And yet, for all Sheila's obvious faults in Act 1, you do get a sense of her rebellious streak, which of course manifests itself with greater urgency as the play goes on. When Mrs. Birling advises pandering to male-dominated society, Mrs. Birling says something like, now Sheila, men with important work to do have to spend their time on their business. And Sheila, her response to this is, I don't believe I will. So we see that she's reluctant to embrace the kind of subordinate gender-based role that Edwardian society has earmarked for her. She kind of shuns that passive subordinate role society has dictated for her. I guess the volume of dialogue in this play speaks volumes about patriarchal power. The men, particularly Mr. Birling, have the lion's share of the dialogue. I've suggested in another video that Eva Smith not being present, in a sense, Eva's been denied a voice by society because of her poverty and perhaps because of her gender as well. And Sheila's relatively fewer lines of dialogue perhaps also allude to that patriarchal bias. When Sheila learns of her involvement in Eva Smith's death, she is rather distressed. That's what the stage directions say, rather distressed. And I guess it's that emotional response to the news that her callous actions had these horrific consequences that prompts that change in her character and her nature. She's also, stage directions say, horrified when she learns that Eva was pregnant when she committed suicide. So she's, in a sense, one of the inspector's first early successes. With this character, the inspector really does enact that change and he's striving for, to force people to reject their self-absorbed ways and come on board to a more socialist way of thinking, prizing community over the individual. When she learns that Mr. Birling sacked Eva, Sheila says that was a mean thing to do. So already Act 1 we're seeing these latent, these subtle signs of her socialist sensibilities developing. And these sensibilities, these feelings, they're amplified by that great line of hers, these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Here we're seeing Sheila refusing to dehumanise the working class, refuses to see them as cogs in the capitalist machine, as little economic units. She's got some real genuine sympathy for a fellow man here. Late in Act 2, Sheila admits, I know I'm to blame. So, as I've said before, this girl is a success story as far as the inspector is concerned. She readily accepts her guilt for her part in Eva's death, and there's a real, genuine sense of shame at her behaviour. When she sees Eva's photograph, her behaviour is described in stage directions thus. She recognises it with a cry, a half-stifled sob, and then runs out. As I say, that deep, emotional impact born of the realisation that her selfishness cost this girl her life enacts that transition from petulant capitalist to passionate socialist. Sin. I've said before in other videos, every character, every Birling and Joe Croft in this play commits a biblical sin against Eva Smith. These are sins that the Bible says are big no-nos. Why does Priestley do this? Just to kind of emphasise how immoral he sees capitalist exploitation as being. Now, Sheila's sin is jealousy. She got Eva sacked pretty much because she used her power and influence to have her hoid out onto the street because Eva smirked at her and ultimately looked better in the dress. So jealousy very much at the heart of her mistreatment of Eva. At the end of the act, she laughs rather hysterically. And again, that's just an indication of how emotionally in flux she is. Inspectors' news of this suicide and Sheila's complicity in it have ushered in great emotional turbulence. And that realisation that her childish conceit and envy contributed to this young girl's hideous death ushers in a real transition and change in her identity, and that quantum leap, I guess, from self-absorbed capitalist to caring, community-orientated socialists.